To discuss this and more, I'm joined now by RT producer Manny Rapolo. Manny, welcome.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
So many are saying that this is Ron Paul's kind of last hurrah. So does this mark an end to, what supporters have been calling the Ron Paul revolution, or at least an end to a chapter?
I think that remains to be seen. Definitely Ron Paul had a very big impact, and the following, I think, this year's while he was running this year was huge compared to previous times that he's run for president. But is this his last hurrah? I think it's far from it. I think that the movement that he's established transcends that, and that I think we definitely have a lot to see from the libertarian movement. Whether or not it's from Ron Paul, it's definitely from the movement that he started.
An interesting thing, Paul told the crowd at this event that he declined a spot at the Republican National Convention. He said, thanks, but no thanks. He instead held this convention, kind of like a convention of his own. And Paul, of course, has proven to be a stark contrast with Mitt Romney, really separating himself from the Republican establishment. So, I mean, what is the significance of that? What do you think this says about Ron Paul?
I think all this says is that Ron Paul stays true to himself and stays true and consistent with the things that he preaches about, and whether or not you want to call it preaching. But Ron Paul is the one candidate, I think, you could say, that really distinguished himself from the other candidates this time around. And for him to have a whole other convention is just, a sign of his consistency in that arena, saying there are things that I don't agree with my own party, with the Republican Party, and I have a set of principles that I abide by, and that the people that support me abide by, and I want to make sure that that platform, that there is a platform for me to convey those principles, and that's exactly what he was doing with this separate convention that he was holding.
And I remember back during the the debates. There were a lot of those debates, and one of the moderators had asked each of the candidates to use one word to describe themselves. Ron Paul used the word consistent, and I think he does stay true to that attribute. Want to talk about a couple of specific things he focused on at this event. His proposal to audit the Fed, he always had that mantra, end the Fed. He's gaining leverage in terms of auditing the Fed. Now there is this proposal to audit the Pentagon. Talk about this.
It's great that you bring this up, because Ron Paul, there's one thing that he's definitely known for, and if you were following the Occupy protests, that's one thing that a lot of people within the movement were always calling for: audit the Fed, and this is something that Ron Paul has been standing behind for a very long time. Unfortunately, he doesn't have that kind of support from the rest of Congress, but with new legislation that we're likely to be seeing regarding auditing the Fed, we might actually see some headway being made in that regard. Now, not only audit the Fed, you also bring up the audit the Pentagon. Now, even though Ron Paul is not going to be speaking at the RNC, his son Rand Paul will be speaking, and that initiative that he's taking to bring up the subject of audit the Pentagon is kind of central to the speech that he's going to be giving at the RNC. So it's going to be interesting to see what Rand Paul has to say, and whether or not it's going to be a perpetuation of Rand Paul's movement through his son Rand, even though it kind of hasn't appeared that way. But it'll be interesting to see whether or not that's actually the case.
And, Ron Paul, he really pushed this issue of auditing the Fed. Other things, small government, his anti-war stance, non-interventionist message. And with this kind of being the culmination of Ron Paul's campaign, Manny, how do you think that all these issues that he has really pushed and brought to the forefront, how they will continue to be pushed and how they will continue to play a role within the Republican establishment? I
think that it's very difficult to answer that question, because we live in a country that is dominated by a two-party system. Republicans and Democrats, there hasn't been a case where you can say that there's really been an effective third party that's, say, the Green Party or Libertarian movement, or even members of the Tea Party haven't had, maybe with Paul Ryan as their first kind of swing at the White House. But it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. Now, you bring up the non-interventionist approach that Ron Paul brings to the table. Well, the reason that I say that this is going to be tricky for the libertarian movement in the future right now, there's absolutely no dialogue in place about the war in Afghanistan from either the Republicans or the Democrats. The one candidate that has been vocal about a non-interventionist approach to foreign policy and getting our troops out of Afghanistan has been Ron Paul. So the legacy that I think we're going to see come out of Ron Paul's constantly running for president every other year is that there is a movement out there that is growing, that has a non-interventionist approach to foreign policy, and above all other things, I think that's going to be Ron Paul's legacy going out of this thing.
Now we just saw in Christine's story there, you know, the normal Ron Paul crowd is very energized, a lot of them very young followers and supporters. Do you think that this kind of signifies the rise of the libertarian movement?
Absolutely, and we've even had instances where we see super PACs coming out by young voters, by young Americans that are saying, you know, there needs to be another party. There needs to be a real debate in this country that's not just coming from the establishment two-party system. And I think that it's young people that are starting that movement, and I think that it's young people that it will eventually lead the way into us seeing a new party in this country.
Do you think young people these days are just sick of this two-party system and want an alternative?
I think young people are upset and frustrated because they keep hearing rhetoric from Washington saying, from the Obama campaign saying hope and change, and how much did we actually see in the 4 years of Obama. And then you have a nominee like Mitt Romney, who is really not that dissimilar to President Obama. And as far as their ideologies, they're really not dissimilar, especially if you compare the United States to other countries of the world that really do have fascist, socialist, right-wing, left-wing parties that are very, very easy to distinguish ideologically. You don't really have that here in the United States. So yes, I think young people are very frustrated, and they're the ones that are going to be leading a new movement to really change the rhetoric, not only in Washington, but politicians across the country.
I think it's interesting. I think that's why Ron Paul on both ends of the spectrum have, or, you know, Republicans and Democrats have called Ron Paul's ideas, they've been described as radical. So he's managed to upset people on both sides of the political spectrum, which kind of proves the point that he certainly has his own views and separates himself from the establishment.
But he's consistent.
But
and that's the one thing they can say. Whether or not you argue that he's radical, he is a consistent person.
Now, we're talking about the rise of the libertarian movement. Can we expect this movement to grow to be an even bigger force to be reckoned with in the future? I mean, this is his third run. We see his traction kind of gaining, you know, he's gaining steam each time. Could he be an even bigger force in the future? Or if not him, an icon like him?
I think that's a very good question. And with someone like Ron Paul, who I think is very strong in his beliefs and very committed to what he does and very committed to public service, from what I gather, I think this really is going to be his last kind of charge. But we have seen this in the past, and it's almost as though it's a dying breed of politicians, people like Ron Paul, people like Dennis Kucinich, people like Ralph Nader, who really were challenging that establishment and that two-party kind of dominance. And so I think that in the future we will be seeing more of a rise, but it's going to be a while, and I don't think that this is really the time to see a new party come out of this.
All right, Manny, thanks so much for coming into the studio and weighing in. That was RT producer Manny Rapolo.